Your wife says she's going out with a friend, but when a man shows up at your door instead, everything changes. What would you do if that night led to betrayal, lies, and the destruction of your marriage? This heart-wrenching story of betrayal and redemption will leave you questioning everything. By 6:15 in the evening, my wife of 2 decades, Karen, still hadn't come home from work or called. Normally, she'd walk through the door by 5:30, since her hours as an executive assistant to James Caldwell of Caldwell Enterprises were from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Karen had been working for James for years before his passing 3 years ago, and when his son, John Caldwell, took over, he kept Karen on as his personal assistant. Our son, Adam, was already home from school, holed up in his room upstairs, tackling his homework so he could relax and watch TV after dinner. By the time 6:30 rolled around, I was starting to get uneasy and decided to give Karen a call. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Just as I left her a message asking her to call me back, she walked through the front door, her arms loaded with bags from Bella's Italian kitchen. On her way to the kitchen, she leaned in, gave me a quick peck on the cheek, and said, "Sorry, sweetheart, I had to work a little late and didn't take anything out for dinner, so I stopped by Bella's. Hope that's all right." Of course, I responded, though the worry was still gnawing at me. "Why didn't you call and let me know?" "I forgot to charge my phone last night," she answered. "By the time I got to my car to call you, it was dead." One of the few things that really bugged me about Karen was that her phone always seemed to either be dead, on silent, or off altogether. It was frustrating when I couldn't reach her if she was out. Whenever I'd mention it, she'd say, "You're right, babe, I'll do better." And for a couple of days, she would. But then, just like that, we'd be right back to square one. Annoying, but I'd learned to accept it. Karen was in good spirits during dinner, but most of the conversation was driven by our 8th-grade son, who was buzzing with excitement about the upcoming soccer tryouts and how his math teacher, Mrs. Thompson, was being unfair with all the homework she was piling on. We always let Adam control the TV until his 9:30 bedtime, though we decided long ago that there wouldn't be a TV in his room, a decision he never stopped complaining about. No TV in our bedroom either, since we believed it might get in the way of what the room was meant for, either sleep or intimacy. The latter we managed at least 3 times a week, which made us a bit of an outlier among our friends and neighbors, most of whom had multiple TVs, even one in the kitchen. Let me give you a little background on us, Tom and Karen Andrews, just for context. I retired last year at 51 after serving as a sergeant with the city's police force. Thanks to the state's retirement program, which allowed military veterans to count their service toward police retirement, I was able to apply my 4 years as a Marine toward my 25-year retirement requirement. Basically, that meant I, along with other military vets, could buy back those service years by paying into the retirement system the same amount the city would have contributed. It worked out great for me. The demands of police work and my side job had kept me in shape, leaving my 6-foot frame with hardly any body fat. After retiring, I took my handyman side gig and turned it into a full-time contracting business. With all the contacts I'd built up over the years doing small renovation jobs, I don't even need to advertise. My reputation for quality work keeps the jobs coming in, and word of mouth ensures I stay busy. My wife, Karen, who will be turning 46 next month, was 26 when we got married. I was 32 at the time, just getting started in my career as a police officer. The specifics of how we got together aren't really important. We met at a party thrown by a mutual friend, and I was immediately drawn to her. She had, and still does, shoulder-length wavy blonde hair, bright green eyes, an infectious smile, and even now at 5 feet 7 inches, she's still the same size 8 as when we first met. While her good looks and fit physique caught my eye, it was her vibrant personality that really won me over. Karen has always had a slightly naive outlook when it comes to other people's motives, but that might just be the cop in me, always a little suspicious of others. Working as an executive assistant for a medium-sized international company, Karen earns a solid salary, and combined with my own growing income from the contracting business, we're pretty comfortable financially. More importantly, we've always had a relationship built on mutual respect and friendship, keeping our marriage an equal partnership. We split parental duties, cooking, and household chores pretty evenly. Of course, there are some tasks that fall more into the traditional roles. I stay far away from her laundry, and she doesn't touch the yard work. I learned my lesson early on when, trying to help, I managed to ruin a few of her nice blouses by not knowing a thing about separating colors. Our son, Adam, had gone into the living room to get his daily fix of TV, while I was in the kitchen helping Karen clear the table and load the dishwasher. Normally, after tidying up, we'd sit down together with a cup of coffee before heading to the den to either chat or just relax. That evening followed the same routine, and as Karen placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of me, she casually mentioned, "Oh, by the way, Amanda got promoted to head the Berlin office, and if you're okay with it, we were thinking of going out for dinner and maybe some dancing tomorrow night to celebrate." I've never paid much attention to Karen's work friends, so I didn't really recall who Amanda was. Not wanting to seem uninterested, I didn't mention that. But the dancing part did catch my attention, so I asked about that. She smiled brightly and said, "You know how much I love to dance, and I hardly ever get the chance since you're not a fan, and, let's be honest, you've never been much of a dancer. So, you're just going to be dancing with her?" I asked, still feeling a little curious. "Of course," she replied, still smiling, "it'll just be a couple of hours. I'll be home by 11. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but since she hardly ever went out with her friends like most of the wives in our circle, I decided to let it slide. The next evening, Karen came home from work and asked what I had planned for dinner for Adam and me. "Mac and cheese," I said, with a bit of authority in my voice. Adam and I both love mac and cheese, but Karen can't stand it and always goes on about the high sodium and calorie count. She gave me a disapproving look but didn't push the matter. "Amanda's picking me up at 7, she said, so I'm going upstairs to shower and get ready while you two fill yourselves with unhealthy food." The following day was Saturday, and Adam had gone to his friend Ben's house with the instruction to be home by 7:30, just in time for the macaroni to be ready. At 7 p.m. sharp, the doorbell rang. Expecting to see Karen's friend, I was surprised to find a sharply dressed man standing there, probably in his mid-30s, tall with dark, wavy hair. At first, I figured he was either a salesman or, worse, a missionary, but I remembered those guys usually come in pairs. Before I could say anything, he extended his hand and said, "Hey, you must be Tom. Karen talks about you all the time." Still puzzled, I shook his hand as he stepped past me into the house. Noticing my confusion, he flashed a bright smile and added, "Oh, maybe you don't remember me. We met briefly at the company holiday party. I'm Jake Phillips. I just wanted to thank you for letting me take Karen out tonight. I guess she mentioned that I'm leaving next week to head our Berlin office, and she's been such an amazing help to me these past few years that I wanted to show my appreciation." All of this happened within just a few seconds, but the way his eyes sized me up, combined with the slightly superior tone in his voice, made it clear he was evaluating me. My brain finally kicked back into gear, and I said, "Well, Jake, there must be." "Call me Jake," he interrupted cheerfully. "Everyone does." Suddenly, it clicked. I continued, more firmly this time, "Well, Jake, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. Give me a moment while I have a word with my wife." I hurried up the stairs as quickly as I could, trying to maintain as much dignity as a man in my situation could. When I stepped into the bedroom, Karen had just finished adjusting her dress and was looking at herself in the full-length mirror. She had on a sleek black cocktail dress that, while not too revealing, certainly wasn't conservative. She picked up her red leather clutch that matched her bright red 4-inch heels, and as she turned to me with a smile, she said, "I heard the door. I guess that's Jake. How do I look?" I didn't answer her, but the mix of shock and anger on my face must have said plenty. She frowned and asked, "What's wrong, Tom?" You look upset. Upset? I practically yelled. My wife is planning to go out with some younger guy who's trying to make a fool out of me, so no, I'm not just upset. I'm furious. I'm embarrassed. There's a man standing in my living room waiting to take you out for what sounds an awful lot like a romantic evening. And unless he's into men, his goal is to get you into bed. The moment her hands went to her hips, I knew the conversation wasn't over, and I could tell by the way she stayed quiet that she was trying to calm herself before delivering her own verbal strike. With more anger than I'd ever heard from her, she finally said, "Well, Tom, I'm the one who's shocked and angry here. First of all, you just accused me of being unfaithful, as if I'd let another man seduce me. That's not only insulting, it's hurtful. Secondly, I've worked with Jake for 3 years, and he's always been nothing but a perfect gentleman. He's never, and I mean never, done anything inappropriate or crossed any lines." Then, grabbing her purse and heading for the door, she added coldly, "I'm not going to leave him waiting downstairs while you make a fool out of yourself. I'll be home by 11, and by then, I hope you've pulled your head out of your backside." I just stood there, speechless, as I watched her head down the stairs. Karen's perspective. I don't think I've ever been this angry before. I thought our marriage was built on trust and mutual respect, and I couldn't believe the implication my husband of 20 years just made. Apparently, the trust one thought we had only went one way. Jake clearly picked up on the fact that something was off. As I kissed him on the cheek, he asked if everything was okay. Forcing a smile, I said, "Everything's fine. Ready to go?" I glanced back up the stairs as Jake placed a hand on the small of my back and led me out the door to his car. Back to Tom's perspective. I was standing at the top of the stairs, watching as my wife leaned in to kiss her date on the cheek. For a brief moment, she looked up at me with what felt like a smirk. Then, he wrapped his arm around her waist and guided her through the door. My anger wasn't just directed at Karen, it was also at myself for not putting my foot down. Letting her leave like that felt like a slap in the face to our marriage, and it felt like she was risking everything we had. As I reflected on the conversation from yesterday, when Karen had casually mentioned her plans to go out for dinner and dancing with a colleague, I started to wonder if she had deliberately avoided using the words he, him, or his. She only ever referred to him as Jake. It struck me as odd because it's hard to talk about someone without using at least one of those pronouns. I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd done it on purpose to mislead me. There was no way she expected me to remember a brief introduction at a crowded office party almost a year ago. Meanwhile, in the car with Karen and Jake. Jake was making small talk, but I was still so upset with Tom that I barely heard any of it. I realized I had zoned out when Jake asked, "So, what do you think?" "Oh, Jake," I replied, "I'm sorry, my mind wandered for a minute." "No worries," he said with a grin. "I was just asking what you thought about having dinner at the Red Fox Grill. It's in the Hilton, and there's a great dance club there too." Forcing myself to push aside my frustration over my argument with Tom, I smiled and said, "That sounds wonderful. I've never been, but I've heard good things." Jake looked at me closely and, squeezing my hand that was resting on my thigh, asked, "Are you okay? You seemed upset when you came downstairs, and your husband didn't seem thrilled about the idea of us going out." The way he said, "going out," and the fact that he squeezed my hand didn't slip past me, but it didn't set off any alarms either. After all, I'd known Jake for 3 years, and plenty of men use casual nicknames with their female friends. "You're right," I admitted. "I thought Tom would remember you from the party, especially since he asked me afterward who I'd been dancing with. Now that I think about it, maybe I called you Charles instead of Jake. I honestly don't remember. I guess when you showed up, he realized you weren't the girlfriend he was expecting and got the wrong idea." Jake gave me a sympathetic look and said softly, "Look, if you want to change your mind about tonight, I'd totally understand. I'd be disappointed, of course, because not only do you look stunning, but I was really looking forward to a few hours on the dance floor with you." Absolutely not, I said, maybe more firmly than I meant to. I'm looking forward to a nice dinner and getting to see those dance moves of yours, which I have to admit are pretty impressive. Tom has 2 left feet and only does the bare minimum when we go out. I didn't want to discourage Jake, so with a playful smile, I added, but let's not forget, I'm a married woman, and I did promise to be home before midnight. You've got me until then. I realized I had told Tom 11 o'clock, but that was before our argument. Jake's smile lit up his face, and as he reached over to briefly touch my knee, he said with a chuckle, "Perfect. Let's have a great time, and don't worry, Cinderella, I'll make sure you're home before the clock strikes midnight." Back at home with Tom, Peter and I sat down to eat our macaroni and cheese, but for the first time ever, I didn't enjoy it. My son asked when his mom would be back, since I'd already told him she was going out for dinner with a friend. There was no way I was going to admit to him that his clueless dad had let his mom go out with another man. That's exactly how I saw it, a date, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Normally, Peter's bedtime on weekends was 10:30, but tonight, I couldn't stand the idea of sitting around by myself, staring at the walls, waiting for Karen to come home. So, I gave him an extra hour. At 11:30, I sent Adam off to bed with a hug. He was at that age now where a kiss was out of the question, it embarrassed him, and I respected that. After he went up, I settled in the living room, staring at the TV with the volume muted, listening for the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My anger had only grown, and I knew I'd be having a serious conversation with Karen when she got back. I had no doubt that her relationship with Jake was purely professional, but that didn't change the fact that a married woman shouldn't be out having dinner and dancing with another man, at least not my wife. I did trust Karen, despite the things I had said earlier, but I didn't trust that smooth-talking guy she was out with. Whether it was my instincts from years on the force or just the jealousy of a husband with an attractive wife, I could see through his polished exterior. His gentlemanly manners couldn't hide the wolfish look in his eyes. I only hoped Karen wouldn't fall for the sheep's clothing. By 11:50, I was fighting the urge to call her, but by the time midnight rolled around, I gave in. I knew her original promise of being home by 11 had turned into, around 11, but I still expected her to answer the phone and say she was on her way. Instead, the call went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. The fact that it went to voicemail immediately told me her phone was off, likely on purpose, and that only stoked my frustration even more. Meanwhile, with Karen and Jake. We had a fantastic dinner at the Red Fox Grill, starting off with a couple of cosmopolitans for me and some wine for Jake. I can't deny that I was flattered by his compliments about how lucky Tom was to have such a beautiful, charming, and sexy wife. When I casually mentioned my age, Jake took the opportunity to boost my ego further, saying he had assumed I'd married an older man and that I didn't look a day over 38. I think most women enjoy a little flattery, and I was no exception. By that point, I had pretty much forgotten about the argument with Tom and was ready to get on the dance floor. The band was excellent, and we danced for almost an hour straight. The only time we sat down was when a slow song came on, and I discreetly led us off the floor. When the band took a break, I excused myself to freshen up in the ladies' room. When I returned, Jake had another cosmopolitan waiting for me and a glass of wine for himself. I was still a little hot from dancing and drank my cocktail faster than I usually would. By the time we got back on the dance floor, I was feeling a bit woozy. A few songs in, a slow number started, and I didn't resist when Jake pulled me into his arms. The next song was another slow one, and I found myself relieved to hold on to him, as the effects of that last drink had me feeling lightheaded and unsteady. Noticing that I wasn't feeling well, Jake suggested we sit out for a while. I barely noticed that he kept his hand on my back as he guided me to our booth, or that he sat next to me instead of across from me, as he had earlier. Back home with Tom. By 1 a.m., I had called Karen's phone 5 times and left 3 messages. The last message I left was, "Karen, if this is your way of punishing me, point taken. But I need you to call me back right now. If I don't hear from you within the next half hour, I'm going to bed and locking the deadbolt. So, you'll just have to spend the night with your friend, knowing you've put our marriage on the line. At this point, I wasn't just angry, I was livid, and my imagination was starting to run wild. 1:30 came and went, but I didn't go to bed. I stayed in the living room, wondering if I'd still have a marriage when the morning came. Meanwhile, with Karen and Jake. I felt Jake's hand slip away from mine and slowly begin to move up the inside of my thigh. I wanted to push him away, but I felt helpless, as if my body wasn't responding to me, even though a part of me was getting aroused. I tried to speak, to say something, but even forming words seemed impossible. I was embarrassed that I had let myself get this drunk. Part of me knew this needed to stop, but another part of me was caught up in the moment, unable to resist. At some point, I vaguely remember hearing a muffled voice and feeling a strong arm helping me out of the booth. The voice said, "Sweetheart, I think you should lie down for a bit. You don't look so good." I felt an arm around me, keeping me steady, guiding me somewhere. I have a hazy memory of standing in an elevator, but I had no idea where we were headed. When we entered a strange room, I saw a bed, and instinctively, I knew I needed to lie down. I wasn't exactly tired, but my body wasn't cooperating, and my mind was spinning. I heard some gentle, comforting words, and then Jake's lips were on mine. Before I knew it, cool air brushed against my skin as my clothes ended up in a heap on the floor. Jake climbed on top of me and started taking me. My eyes closed almost automatically. When I managed to open them briefly, I saw his face hovering over me, dark eyes staring into mine as he continued. "Not Tom. Not Tom." My mind was screaming, but no words came out of my mouth. I just lay there, my body trembling as a powerful climax shook through me. Back at home with Tom, in full panic. By 5 a.m., after making countless calls that went unanswered, I finally collapsed onto the bed, falling into a restless, exhausted sleep. Deep down, I knew our marriage was over. There could be no excuse, no way to forgive what had happened. It felt like a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Just after 7 a.m., my phone rang. For a moment, I considered not answering, assuming it was Karen and knowing there was nothing she could say to fix the damage that had been done. But when I glanced at the caller ID, it wasn't her. It was a number I didn't recognize. With a groggy sigh, I answered, "Hello." The voice on the other end asked, "Is this Tom Andrews?" As I confirmed that it was, a wave of nausea hit me. Maybe that catastrophic event I dismissed earlier was more real than I had thought. The voice continued, "Tom, this is Sam Harris. Remember me?" Sam had been one of the newer patrol officers I supervised before I retired. He was an ex-Marine and a sharp cop, more street-smart than some of the others who hadn't served in the military. "Of course, Sam," I replied, the worry clear in my voice. "What's going on?" There was a pause, and then he asked, "Is your wife home?" My heart started to race, and my mind filled with dread as I answered, "No, she went out for dinner with a colleague and was supposed to be home by 11 last night. I've been calling her, but all my calls go straight to voicemail." "Is she okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yes and no, Tom," Sam responded. "She's at General Hospital. She came into the ER a few hours ago, saying she'd been sexually assaulted. I was the one who caught the call, but all she would tell us was her name and that her husband used to be a cop. She won't talk to anyone else but you. She doesn't have any visible injuries, but the doctors are running blood tests and have started a sexual assault kit. I hate to be the one to break this to you, but you need to come down here as soon as possible. I'll have to notify the detectives, but I wanted to give you a heads up first." "How soon can you get here?" 15 minutes, I snapped in reply. "Got it, Tom," Sam responded. "Normally, I'd need to get back on patrol once the detectives show up, but I'll hold off for a bit so you can make it here before they arrive." Thanks, Sam, I said, genuinely appreciating it. I'll be there as fast as I can. My first thought was that I was going to kill that bastard. But before I could leave, I knew I couldn't just let Adam wake up in an empty house with no idea of what was happening. I hurried to his room and gently shook him awake, whispering, "Adam, wake up, buddy." He rubbed his eyes, looking groggy and confused, but I didn't have time to waste. "Listen, your mom was in a small car accident. She's fine, but they're checking her out at the hospital just to be sure. I need to head down there with the insurance info. I didn't want you waking up alone and worrying. She's okay, no injuries, so go back to sleep, alright? I'll be back soon." He mumbled a sleepy, "Okay, Dad," and turned back over, still half asleep. My hands were trembling so badly that I struggled to even get the key into the ignition. Meanwhile, Karen's thoughts at the hospital. When I woke up, it wasn't the grogginess that hit me first, it was the overwhelming need to use the bathroom. I was still disoriented and confused, but I managed to slip out of bed and make my way to the dimly lit bathroom, the only light coming from the nightlight in the corner. As I sat down, my brain slowly started to clear, and that's when it hit me, I wasn't at home. While sitting there, I realized it wasn't just the urge to go that woke me. There was a deep, aching pain in my lower back. When I wiped myself, I saw smears of blood on the toilet paper. And in that instant, I knew, I had been assaulted. Memories of the previous night began to trickle in, disjointed and terrifying. The more I remembered, the more nauseous I felt. I barely had time to spin around and collapse to my knees before I started retching into the toilet. When my stomach was empty, I stood up shakily, leaning against the vanity for support, staring at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. My eyes were bloodshot, and there were bite marks on my shoulder and neck. My hair was stiff in places, matted with what I could only assume was dried semen. A wave of shame and guilt crashed over me so suddenly, it knocked the breath from my lungs. I couldn't stand to look at myself any longer. The woman staring back at me wasn't the confident wife and loving mother I was supposed to be. Leaning heavily on the counter, I hung my head, and tears began to fall. When I finally forced myself to look up again, it was as if I was seeing a stranger, a broken, devastated woman who had let her stupidity and stubbornness cost her everything. I had lost my self-respect, my husband, and maybe even the respect of my son. If I'd had a knife or gun at that moment, I would have killed the man who had stolen my life for his own selfish desires. How did I get this drunk? I thought, as I tried to piece together what little I could remember. I had only had 3 drinks, 2 at the restaurant and 1 at the club. Enough for a buzz, sure, but not enough to make me lose control like that. "He drugged me," I whispered aloud. "That disgusting man must have put something in my drink." I knew what I wanted to do. When I walked back into the room and saw him lying there, sleeping naked on his back, the urge to claw his eyes out or rip him apart surged through me. I imagined sinking my teeth into his throat, tearing him to shreds. But I knew I wasn't strong enough to pull that off. I had to do the only thing I could. Quietly, I got dressed, taking one last hateful look at the man I had once admired, and then I slipped out of the room. Tom arrives at the hospital. It took me just under 15 minutes to get to the emergency room, and true to his word, Sam was waiting for me. The waiting area was nearly empty, given how early it was. "Where is she?" I asked, almost demanding, as I made my way toward the curtained-off areas. Sam quickly stopped me, placing a firm hand on my chest. "Hold up, Tom. She's asleep. They gave her something to calm her down. She was pretty shaken up. The detectives will be here any minute, so use this time to get your story straight." "Story straight?" I snapped, anger rising in my voice. "What the hell do you mean by that?" Sam still had the look and presence of a Marine. Even though I kept myself in decent shape, he was 15 years younger and clearly stronger. He took me by the arm and gently, but firmly, led me off to a quiet corner, away from any listening ears. "Look, Tom," he whispered, "I'm on your side here. I don't know what's going on in your marriage, and honestly, I don't want to know. But here's what I do know, your wife showed up here around 4:15 this morning in a cab, saying she'd been assaulted. The detectives are going to ask where you were, why she wasn't home with her family, who she was with, and how she ended up here dressed for a night out. She refused to answer any of those questions when I asked, only saying, 'I want to talk to my husband.' Out of respect for you, I didn't press, but the detectives aren't going to be so lenient. All I'm saying is, get your thoughts together and be ready to handle this in a way that minimizes the damage for you and your family." Before I could even thank Sam, two things happened at once: the detectives arrived, and the ER doctor started walking toward us. One of the detectives was male, and the other was female. I recognized the guy, Bob Anderson. We had worked several crime scenes together back in the day. He was old school, with about 30 years on the force. When Bob saw the doctor approaching me, he hung back, but the female detective kept moving forward. Bob gently placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered something. She didn't look happy but stopped in her tracks. The doctor approached and asked, "Are you the patient's husband?" I couldn't help but notice he said, "patient's husband, not victim's husband." Sam gave me a quick pat on the back and headed out as the doctor, with a slight Middle Eastern accent, began to speak. "I'm Dr. Kamal. Your wife doesn't have any major visible injuries, but there was some tearing of her rectum, which should heal on its own without surgery. There are also some bite marks on her breasts, what some might call hickeys, but they don't require treatment either." My heart sank, and a wave of nausea hit me as I imagined Karen being violated, her body marked by that predator. "We've conducted a sexual assault exam," Dr. Kamal continued. "There was semen found in both her vaginal and anal cavities. Additionally, there was dried semen in her hair, indicating recent sexual activity. We've drawn blood to test for any drugs or alcohol, but we don't have those results yet. For now, the presence of semen suggests recent sexual activity, but until the toxicology results come back, that's all I can tell you, or the investigators." The way he kept saying, "sexual activity," was really pissing me off. It made it sound like this could have been consensual, and the phrasing felt like a slap in the face. There's a world of difference between sexual activity and sexual assault, but he just kept going. "Your wife has refused to answer any questions about what happened, other than claiming she was drugged before the assault and insisting on speaking only to you. Right now, I don't see any medical reason to keep her here, but I'd like to hold off on her discharge until the blood test results are back. I'll be in a better position to make a final call then. She's been given a mild sedative to calm her down, but she's awake now, and you're free to see her. Any questions, Mr. Andrews?" I shook my head and muttered, "No." "Well, if anything comes up, just have me paged. I expect the test results in about an hour, and I'll consult with you then." Without a word of sympathy or even the slightest condolence, the doctor turned and walked away. I headed toward the cubicle area when the female detective, a short brunette with a sharp face and close-set eyes, stepped in front of me, blocking my path. My first instinct was to brush past her, but before I could, she said in an authoritative tone, "I'm sorry, Mr. Andrews, but my partner and I need to speak with your wife first. This is an active investigation, and we need her statement before you see her." I glanced over at Bob, who was already shaking his head in frustration as he walked up. "Let it go, Thompson," he said firmly. "Tom can see his wife for a few minutes, and then we'll conduct the interview." Her face flushed with embarrassment at being overruled, and she replied indignantly, "Bob, you know the protocol. If we let him in first, he could influence her statement, which could come back to bite us in court." Later, I learned her name was Sarah Thompson, a 28-year-old fresh out of college with less than 5 years on the job and barely a year in the detective unit. Bob responded with a hint of sarcasm, "Look, Thompson, I was making felony arrests before you were even born. As lead detective, I make the calls. Tom Andrews is a colleague, retired or not, and he deserves a bit of professional courtesy. If that doesn't sit well with you, feel free to wait in the cafeteria or head back to the car. And if you want to file a report on me, go ahead. I could use a reason to finally retire." With that, Detective Thompson spun on her heels and stormed off. Once she was out of earshot, Bob muttered under his breath, "Damn rookie." Turning back to me, he said, "Go ahead, Tom. You've got 15 minutes. I'll finish some paperwork from our last case." When I pulled back the curtain to Karen's cubicle, she turned her head. As soon as she saw it was me, she immediately looked away and started sobbing. I pulled up a chair, sitting there quietly, giving her the time to regain her composure. Sure, seeing her like that made me feel sympathetic, but if I'm being honest, anger still overshadowed any empathy. She had deceived me by deliberately omitting that Jake was a man, letting me assume she was going out with a girlfriend. And now here we were. Karen's attempt to explain. I couldn't bring myself to meet Tom's eyes, so I just turned my head and cried. I had desperately wanted him by my side, but now that he was here, I didn't know what to say. How do you apologize for ignoring your husband's concerns and ending up in the arms of a predator? The reality hit me hard. It was a date, no matter how innocent my intentions had been. I went out to dinner and dancing with a man who wasn't my husband. How would I have reacted if the situation had been reversed? If Tom had told me he was going out with a friend named Alex, only for Alex to turn out to be Alexis, a younger, attractive woman? I knew exactly how I would have reacted, and the thought of it terrified me. Karen's perspective. Tom's voice interrupted my thoughts as he said, "Karen, the detectives are going to come in soon to take your statement, so you should be ready for it. Some of the questions are going to be invasive and uncomfortable. But if your claim is that you were mentally incapacitated due to drugs or alcohol, just be honest. I have to warn you, Karen, if you try to deceive them, they'll figure it out. The lead detective has been at this for over 30 years, and he's an expert at seeing through lies." His tone was cold, almost like a lawyer's, not like my husband's. The words, claim, and deception, hit me like a punch, making my anger rise through the tears. Finally, I looked at him and snapped, "Tom, you sound like you don't believe me. I didn't talk to anyone until you got here because you've known me for over 20 years. Yes, I made a stupid decision, but I never intended to have sex with anyone. I wasn't seduced, I was drugged. Damn it, Tom, you should know me better than this. If you don't, maybe you should just leave." I turned my head away, too furious to cry anymore. I heard the scrape of his chair on the tile floor. Without another word, the curtain opened and closed. He was gone, maybe for good. Tom's perspective. When I walked back into the waiting room, Bob glanced up at me with a questioning look. His partner, Detective Thompson, was sitting across the room with her arms folded, scowling. "Thanks, Bob," I said, genuinely grateful. I knew he could get into trouble for bending the rules for me. "You can go in now. Just so you know, I deliberately provoked her, and I believe she's telling the truth." Bob nodded and signaled to his reluctant partner, who followed him into the cubicle, clearly irritated. About 45 minutes later, neither Bob nor his partner had returned when I noticed Dr. Kamal scanning the now crowded waiting room. Spotting me, he motioned for me to follow him. We headed to a small exam room down the hall. Once we were seated, he spoke in a tone that was more personal than before. "The lab results are back, and they show a significant presence of rohypnol and ketamine in your wife's system. As I'm sure you're aware, these are commonly known as date rape drugs. Combined, they lower inhibitions, heighten sexual desire, and impair the body's ability to respond, making resistance nearly impossible. I've explained this to the detectives and provided them with a copy of the toxicology report. We've started treatment to help flush the drugs from her system, and she should be ready for release in about 3 hours." He extended his hand to me, adding, "I'm truly sorry that you and your wife are going through this. Given the circumstances, I think time and counseling may be necessary for both of you to heal. As he stood to leave, I asked, Doctor, can I ask you something else? Dr. Kamal paused, clearly hesitating, but then nodded and sat back down. It seemed like he already knew what was coming, which only added to the tension. I understand about the drugs and how they affect someone physically, but what I really need to know is, do they prevent someone from feeling, sexual pleasure? Dr. Kamal sighed, then motioned for me to sit back down. Speaking with a tone that was both patient and slightly weary, he replied, Mr. Andrews, I can't give you a definite answer, but here's what I can say. When a person's sexual organs are stimulated, the body may respond involuntarily to that stimulation, regardless of the person's mental or emotional state. The physical response is biological, it's not tied to conscious participation. In some cases, yes, it's possible for someone to climax during an assault, which often makes the emotional trauma even worse. The victim can feel like their own body betrayed them. Dr. Kamal paused for a moment, then added, even victims who aren't drugged and are forcibly assaulted sometimes report climaxing. It's one of the cruelties of sexual trauma. It doesn't mean the assault wasn't real. The body's response is automatic, like feeling pain. It's completely involuntary. With that, he stood up again, gave my shoulder a reassuring pat, and walked away, probably relieved I didn't have any more difficult questions for him. As I stood there, processing everything he had just told me, I noticed Bob and his partner standing near the entrance to the treatment area, waiting for the doctor to finish. Bob approached first, his partner still hanging back, though her demeanor was a little less hostile than earlier. Bob addressed me directly. Tom, I've known you for a long time, so I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Based on her statement and the lab results, it's clear your wife was drugged, and she wasn't able to give consent. That means she was assaulted. He paused, glancing around the room before continuing in a quieter voice, but here's the hard part. As much as it pains me to say this, I wouldn't recommend pressing charges against this guy. I was about to protest, but Bob quickly raised his hand to stop me. Hear me out, Tom. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But you know how the system works better than most. The defense will argue that Karen voluntarily went out with this guy, had drinks, and danced with him. It won't matter that she didn't mention his gender to you when she talked about her plans. What the jury's going to see is that she spent the evening with another man. Bob's expression darkened as he continued, they'll say she took the drugs willingly. There are plenty of cases where people have taken these drugs to loosen up. And if the defense attorney is half as ruthless as most are, they'll drag you both through the mud. They'll paint her as a promiscuous wife who made up a story when she realized how much time had passed, and you'll be cast as the naive husband who couldn't keep his wife in check. The media will have a field day. My fists clenched involuntarily, anger surging through me. Bob placed a hand on my shoulder, softening his tone. Tom, I know this isn't what you want to hear, but you need to think about Adam. Do you want him to grow up hearing whispers and rumors, seeing your family's name plastered all over the news? Do you want this to haunt the rest of your lives? If this scumbag gets a decent lawyer, he's likely to walk free, and your family will be left to pick up the pieces. I stood there, torn apart inside. Bob was right. I had seen too many cases like this fall apart in court. But the thought of letting that monster walk away without consequences was unbearable. Bob gave me a moment to take it all in before adding, talk to Karen, Tom. She has to be the one to decide. But if you both choose to let this go, I can make sure the report disappears. It'll be like none of this ever happened, and you can move forward. I nodded numbly. Thanks, Bob. I'll talk to her. He nodded back, giving me a small, understanding smile. Take your time. Whatever you choose, I've got your back. Karen's reaction. When I returned to the hospital room, Karen was lying there, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. I pulled up a chair beside her, but before I could even say a word, she spoke, her voice raw and broken. They don't believe me, do they? No one does, not the doctor, not the police, not even you. She started sobbing again, and I reached out to take her hand, but she pulled it away, her whole body trembling with emotion. Karen, we all believe you, I said softly, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. This isn't about whether or not people believe you. It's about what will happen if we take this to court. I explained to Karen what Bob had told me, that the defense would twist everything, smear her reputation, and paint her as someone who willingly participated and only regretted it later. She listened, her expression a painful mix of anger and hopelessness. So, what now? We just let him walk away like nothing happened. No, I said firmly, holding her hand tightly. This isn't about letting him get away with anything. It's about protecting you and Adam from what could happen if we push this to court. The legal system, it's not built to help people like you. It's built to tear you apart. Karen stared at me, her lip trembling. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, with a resigned sigh, she nodded. Fine, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We won't press charges. But I want him to suffer, Tom. I want him to pay. I squeezed her hand. He will, Karen. One way or another, he'll pay. In the end, Bob kept his word. The report was buried, and the case never made it to court. Jake Phillips didn't end up in prison, but Karen got a small victory when the company quietly fired him. They gave her a settlement, enough to avoid the mess of a public lawsuit. Jake didn't get the promotion to Berlin, and after 15 years with the company, he was dismissed with no letter of recommendation. As for our marriage, we gave it a shot. We went to counseling, both individually and together, but the damage ran too deep. We separated 8 months later, and by the time the divorce was finalized, we were both emotionally drained. Karen kept the house until Adam finished high school, and I started over in a small apartment. I moved on, but I've never been able to shake the memory of Karen leaning up to kiss Jake on the cheek before she walked out of our home that night. That image haunts me more than the details of the assault. The betrayal, the deception, the disrespect, it was all too much for me to forgive. It's been 2 years since the divorce. Karen is dating someone new, a guy younger than her, and they seem happy. I've started seeing someone, too, Natalie, a former client of mine who went through her own rough divorce. Her 14-year-old son, Ryan, has become good friends with Adam, and the boys get along great. We're taking things slow, keeping separate places for now, but for the first time in a long while, I'm feeling hopeful again. As for Jake Phillips, I never told Karen what happened to him after he was fired. Some things are better left unsaid. One day, I ran into an old buddy of mine from my police days, Frank, the type of guy who had his own ways of dealing with people who deserved it. Over drinks, Frank casually mentioned that Jake Phillips wouldn't be hurting anyone else again. I didn't press him for details, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. Sometimes, life has a way of evening the score. Epilogue. Karen and I have found a fragile peace, for Adam's sake. We're civil when we see each other, but the scars of our past haven't completely healed. We both regret that we couldn't save our marriage, but we've come to accept it. These days, I'm focused on rebuilding my life with Natalie and the kids, and for the first time in a long time, I feel optimistic about what's ahead.